Our next speaker is Noah Robinson, son of our beloved Senator Art Robinson. Dr. Robinson is running for the Senate seat his father now holds. As you all know, Measure 113 caused many of our most conservative senators not to be able to run again. Unfortunately, fortunately, Senator Robinson has a brilliant son to carry on. In fact, as a side note, all of Senator Robinson's 6 kids have PhDs in some form of science. Where are you, Dr. Robinson? Come on up.
Thank you very much, Holly. It's wonderful to be here today. I'm here for a scientific talk on global warming. I'll make a few comments. Bill is exactly right. That's the problem we have up there. If we can get the Republicans to say no, I think we can beat the Democrats. And you see this over and over again. That is why you see I'm running for the Senate. And it's interesting, I have an opponent, but my real opponent is the lobbyists and the organized lobbyists. Over 100 lobby firms are giving money to my opponent. Because what they don't so much want my opponent in, they want us out. The problem is that when you say no, you offend the people that won't, and it's very embarrassing for them. I think we can, part of our job is not just to say no, but to try to convince the others to say no. We're scientists. My dad's a scientist. I'm a scientist. So we approach the Senate from a sort of a different background. The question of truth, not a question of what's politically expedient. And it's kind of a foreign concept up there. And in campaigns, when we got into politics, we discovered that, everyone knows Canada's lying political campaign. It's just almost a rigor. There's all sorts of jokes about it. My dad got up there, he tried to teach science to the senators, tried to teach them what's a molecule. They don't know. Many people don't know. They don't know anything about the basics of global warming, which is what I'm going to talk about today, because they just don't know. And it's become a political issue. So things that should be scientific, it's just a strict question of what's scientifically correct, is now a big political issue. And we've done quite a bit of good up there. My dad's lectured them a lot, told them things like that. And I will get to the subject in a minute. But it's a very foreign environment. My brother called me, just a side note, my brother called me on the way over here because he says, didn't Goodwin tell you that she just wanted to serve one term and then she'd promote you as the next senator? And I said, well, yeah, because she actually did call me just before she filed as a courtesy. That's fine, saying I'm running against you. And then she says, and she tried to convince us to quit. At that time, we didn't know whether it'd be my dad or I running. She tried to convince us to quit. Well, that's fine too. She commented, don't you want your dad to go out on a high note? Which my dad found that was amusing. But then she says, I just want to serve one term, and then I'll promote you. And this is, of course, a deal, right? Just like the others. It's a deal making. I would never go for that. For one thing, I'm not really interested in the position. I'm interested in what I can do this term with it. The idea that you'd make some sort of deal in order to be the next senator 4 years later is unappealing. But the reason my brother called, he says, she told you that, but she just told the Oregonian that the reason she's running against you is because she's frightened about the idea of another Robinson being up there. And so I think the Democrats are frightened about us. Remember the definition of politics, which is a poly meaning many, and ticks meaning blood-sucking creatures. So I'd like to talk a little bit about global warming. You see the slide up there? There we go. So this subject, you can actually dismiss it pretty quickly with this one slide. I've got a lot of slides. These are from an article, from a review article my dad and I and Willie Soon published in 2007. It was a part of a project to try to show that there was not a consensus of scientists that believed that global warming was a problem that needed to be caused by humans that needed to be solved. So it's a very careful review article on the subject. There's something like 160 references in it. I might have the number quite slightly wrong, but it's approximately right. We've got copies of it in the back. Ultimately, I think about 31,000 scientists, American scientists, these are people with PhDs or college-level degrees in science, signed the petition saying the government should take no action because this was not a threat. And we had a lot of people sign it. We also had a lot of famous names sign it. Edward Teller signed it. Martin Kamen signed it. John Clauser, who won the physics prize just a year ago, signed that in 1998. So there's a lot of scientists that realize that this is a problem. And so anyway, we wrote the review article, and you can get copies of it, and it just summarizes the science of the subject. And remember that the theory is that releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is a greenhouse gas, will cause the Earth to heat up and eventually kill us all because it'll get too hot and we won't be able to live here. The first obvious flaw in that is that carbon dioxide is a very minor greenhouse gas. It can't do much. Theoretically, you can calculate it something like 0.01 degrees with the change in CO2 we've had. It's trivial, and it's pretty much saturated. The absorption spectrum is saturated, so as you go up, you can't get much more out of it. So this theory is based on computer models, and the computer models basically say that release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere will increase the temperature just slightly, and that will cause evaporation of water from the oceans. And then that water, because water is a big greenhouse gas, will cause the temperature to spiral out of control and we'll all be fried. Now, of course, this inherently doesn't make any sense. There's a principle in chemistry called Le Chatelier's principle that when you push on a system, it tends to push back. And this is not an unstable, the Earth's climate is not an unstable system. If this was going to happen, it would have happened long ago. So then they point to, a little rise in the current temperature and say, this is caused by carbon dioxide. Now, the computer models themselves are very complicated. They won't even sometimes give you the data on how they work or the background of the models, because there's all sorts of models. So they're incredibly complicated. So to try to prove why, the climate is incredibly complicated. To try to understand the climate is almost impossible. It's worth studying, but to pretend they understand it is ridiculous. But you can prove that the rise in CO2 is not affecting the climate. So this is the temperature in the Sargasso Sea. It's measured by measuring sediment as you go down, and the sediment builds up in the bottom of the ocean and gradually rises. And you can measure oxygen 18 ratios and other things, so you get an idea of the date that you took the sample, and then you can get some idea of the temperature. And so it's approximate, it's pretty good data. And so you can see what happens. First, the first thing is obvious. This goes back to about 3,000 years. The temperature fluctuates up and down all the time. There's nothing unusual about changes in temperature. We are coming out of what's known as the Little Ice Age a few hundred years ago. You remember George Washington, the pictures of George Washington in Valley Forge. It was cold. It was unusually cold back then. That was sort of at the bottom of the Little Ice Age. The temperature has been rising, but you have that little point up there that's called the medieval climate optimum. At that point, the weather was warmer, and there's all sorts of historical records on it. The crops grew better, everything was better, life was better. We're actually better off a little warmer than cooler. So there's natural fluctuations, and you see it's been warmer in the past, but there's natural fluctuations. And so the takeaway from this graph is basically the temperature of the Earth fluctuates. And we can try to figure out exactly why it fluctuates, but it fluctuates. The recent rise is nothing unusual. So let's see, is this next slide here? Okay, so this further makes the point. That's the temperature increase per century going on about right now. And this is just making an illustration. You look at how much the temperature fluctuates day to night, how much it fluctuates, winter to summer. We deal with enormously wide temperature fluctuations, and even though it's natural, that little rise is not going to hurt us. So just illustrating that. This is more detailed data. This goes back to 1880. And I should also put a caveat in here. This paper was written in 2007. We've kept up to date. There's been no change in the trends. I've updated some of the graphs. This graph has been updated 2022. A few of them just have the old data. There's no significant difference. We've been actually on a project to fix that. We've just been distracted by a lot of things. But you can see what happened. There's actually a period in the 1940s that was a little warmer, and it got cooler again. Back then, they were worried about global cooling, if you remember that. And then the temperature started rising again, so now it's global warming. You look at the scale, it's only a degree or so. It's not that big a difference. there are efforts, and the subject has become extremely politicized, and there's a lot of dishonesty involved. And a lot of the government agencies that are putting out these reports and so forth, there's an agenda behind it. There's actually efforts to try to go back to the historical data and suppress the peak in the past because it makes them look bad. So there's a big debate about that. But there's all sorts of, there's good data on it. The temperature's been going up and down, and we're just in a little warm period. It's actually been fairly stable recently. Now, if you're wondering what might affect the temperature of the Earth, it's not CO2. So there's all sorts of theories, and like I said, the thing is very complicated, but the most obvious thing is, what about the sun? The sun, is the sun affecting the temperature of the Earth? Well, I think it's fairly obvious. And there's ways of measuring solar intensity, and actually the intensity of the sun fluctuates a little bit. And while you can't prove everything definitively, it is very interesting that the temperature of the Earth seems to correlate with changes in the intensity of the sun. So I think it's pretty obvious. So now this goes back to, okay, so now the question is, okay, if the temperature's been rising, and the CO2, and remember we didn't start burning a lot of hydrocarbons until, it really took off about 1950, then we can go back and look at the data and say, well, did the temperature rise start to get worse when we burned hydrocarbons? And the answer is no. So you look here again at the same graph, you show solar activity on top of the temperature. And it just simply does not correlate with the burning of hydrocarbon energy. And this is very important because you realize that if they cut off our hydrocarbon energy in the United States, we're going to get poorer, a lot poorer. People in third world countries will die. In Africa, they're struggling to lift themselves out of poverty. And they're trying to adopt modern technology. You take away their hydrocarbon fuels, people will die. And that's the effort. And a lot of the people that are promoting this actually think there should be fewer people in the world, and there's an agenda behind some of this. But we actually promote nuclear power. Actually, we promote freedom of energy. The government should not be deciding what type of energy Americans should be using. Let industry figure that out. But if you look at the forms of energy, nuclear energy is by far the best. It produces, it's cheap, it's efficient. They've made it expensive. We finally got in Georgia, they're just building a new nuclear power plant. The cost is about 10 times what it should be because the government got involved. The regulations are absolutely insane. But nuclear energy is by far the cheapest, most effective and way of making energy. But hydrocarbons are essential too. They want us to all drive electric cars. And you see where that's going. If you're wealthy and want to look green, and you can get an electric car and then figure out where to charge it. So when electric cars become practical and batteries become practical and they can compete in the free market with gasoline cars, which I think is going to be a while, then you can buy them if you want to. Right now it's just a joke. So now there's some other things to look at. They talk about the glaciers. They're afraid that the glaciers are getting shorter. And that we're going to, glacier shortening, and the sea level is going to come up and flood us. And they show pictures of Florida underwater, New York underwater, and it's ridiculous. So you look back at the trends on glaciers. Here, there's good data on, you have to normalize it properly. The reference again is in that. I don't have good references on these. I just took the slideshow, but again, the paper on the subject out there has references for everything in it. And you can see the glaciers have been, as we come up out of the little ice age from 1800, the glaciers have been getting shorter, and it correlates with the temperature change over that time. In 1800, we weren't burning many hydrocarbons. It started off, trend has continued at about the same rate. There's been no change since we started burning hydrocarbons. The same is true of sea level rise. And because you can measure the sea level very accurately, now they can measure it with satellites, so you have really good measurements on it. But there's historical data on it, and you can see, so we get the best. It's more scattered back here because the data isn't as accurate. You're trying to average stations and various things that were measured back then. But you can see that the trend is about 7 inches per century. It tends to go up for a while, and go down, then go up, so there's acceleration. I think we're going at about 11 inches per century now. But if based on the historical trend, it'll probably slow down, but we've had steep periods, level periods, steep periods. The trend is essentially the same. We've been burning hydrocarbons for a long time, and there's been no change in the sea level rise. And then think about the number. It's 7 inches per century. So we're going to be flooded and washed away by a 7-inch rise in the sea level every 100 years. I think we can adapt to that. It's a natural phenomenon. You might have to adapt to it, but we can adapt to it. There's a very funny article published. Someone did a scientific study that the internet's going to be shut off because the sea level will rise. And what? Well, they looked at the internet cables go down under the ocean. And of course, these cables are designed so that they can withstand seawater. But the interfaces at the top of the ocean can't take the sea level, the seawater change, the harsh caustic, salt in the sea. And so if the water comes up a little bit, it'll ruin the connections. And of course, the article kind of assumed that nobody would go in and fix it. It was very, very interesting. So this again, this is another graph on that. So you can see that one's got the error bars. So you can see it's very approximate back there. And then as you get closer, the data is very good, and you can see what it is. They also talk about, we're going to dry out. The droughts in California are caused by global warming. Well, has rainfall been changing? Of course, there's fluctuations. We've had droughts forever. Read books back. 1800s we had droughts. We had droughts at the beginning of the 1900s. We have droughts. We have local droughts. It happens. That rainfall actually has been rising slightly. There's a very slight increase, and it's continued. When we published this in 2007, the slope was actually very similar. So there's a very slight increase in rainfall, which is nice. Again, a natural phenomenon. Tornadoes. They worry about the storms. And remember that this is partly an internet phenomenon, because with modern communications, we see what happens all over the world. So when a tornado hits somewhere in the United States, it's on the news. It's on the social media. Everyone sees it. So there's perception that these things might be getting worse just because we can see them in real time and we weren't looking at the past. But again, the question is, are tornadoes getting worse? No, we're getting fewer tornadoes. So you have to measure this severe tornadoes. There's a problem sometimes with historical data because who is keeping track? So the severe ones tend to get recorded and the more minor ones don't. And so you can have biased data. So that's why you'll see in some of these things severe tornadoes, because we know the data is consistent going back. And there's a lot of people that study this and look at it very carefully and so forth. Whoops. And again, you look at hurricanes. And again, you see it's the hurricanes that made landfall, because now we can see every little hurricane that develops out in the ocean. And back then we couldn't. So again, we take something so we have a consistent trend. And you see it goes up and down. Some years you'll have a lot of hurricanes, sometimes you'll have very few. But the trend is it's fairly level, but it's actually down. And this is hurricane wind speed. So then are the hurricanes worse? Well, no. The number isn't up. The maximum speed of the hurricanes isn't up. These things have been going on for a long time. My dad's father built chemical plants. He was the chief engineer for Union Carbide. And he likes to tell the story about how they did everything with slide rules back then. And so the engineers overbuilt everything. Nowadays we have computers, so things tend to get a little bit, I think, too precisely engineered. So he over-engineered everything, and the fractionating towers on the chemical plant in Seadrift, Texas were designed for 100-mile-per-hour winds. But when the hurricane went over at 180 miles an hour, they still stood. This was, the 1950s or something? They were having hurricanes back then. So this isn't new. This is a table, going back to that first graph I showed you, and this I don't have time to explain in tremendous detail, but when you look at a historical data like that, you're looking at the isotope ratios, and you're trying to say, okay, we think we're measuring the temperature accurately with this, what's called a proxy, and the question is, does the data we get make sense? And can you see, the warm, and there's all sorts of historical data you can use to check it. Are the peaks reasonable? Are the troughs reasonable? And this just basically summarizes all the historical data statistically. And this is, again, I should have the reference on that, but it's in the paper, and shows that, yes, that graph, in fact, makes perfect sense. Oops. There we go. So on this graph, we put all of or not all, but a variety of different things together. It's interesting, the sea level, this is sort of a fine feature just of interest scientifically, is that the sea level and the glacier shortening seem to go pretty nicely with the fluctuations in temperature. And solar activity on top. So that's there. This is, again, satellite data. This shows from 1980, and this one is only to 2007. So that one we have to update. But there's just been a very slight upward trend. They also go back and they take ice core samples. And I'm suspicious about the time scales, especially being a Christian. But they correlate in some way. And if you look at the fluctuations, they're actually a lot wider when they take that data. And we're actually in a warm period. If we drop 8 degrees, we might actually be in trouble. So we'd rather have warming than cooling. This is, again, another one of the graphs. I put some of these things in here. But then there's another whole aspect to this, and that's that what is CO2 actually doing for us? Because CO2 actually has an enormous benefit. I remember my dad gave a talk in Eugene when he was running against DeFazio, and DeFazio had only debated at very liberal forums. And after the debate, my dad had talked about global warming, and this lady came up to him. She was a liberal. She was sincere. She was terrified. And she says, "You've got to change your position on this. You don't understand. There's this evil thing called carbon. It's going to kill us all." It was almost a direct quote. She was terrified because they convinced her that carbon, she didn't know the difference between carbon and carbon dioxide, and she had been convinced that it would kill us. But if we don't have carbon dioxide, life on Earth can't exist without it, because the plants are made out of carbon dioxide. They give off the oxygen we breathe. We breathe out CO2. The CO2, it's a cycle. And it actually turns out that when you raise the carbon dioxide levels, the plants grow more rapidly. This is basically a measure of all the timber standing in the United States. And there's the enviros will tell you that we're cutting the last tree, and and there's not going to be anything left. And for 50 years, it's been steadily up. Part of that is because of the CO2 increase. We're also getting less wildfires. Now, this graph I find interesting. This is a more recent one. If you look back in this is a good estimate of the amount of area burned by wildfires every year. And way back, we didn't have good fire management, and so there was a lot more burning of it. And then down in the 1960s and the 1980s, we got control of the forests, managed the forests well. We didn't have that many wildfires. It's not that much up, but it is up, and that is, of course, caused by mismanagement of the forest. The government won't let us deal with it. That's a whole other issue. This is not just because of CO2. Production of crops, farming methods have gotten better and better, but the ability to produce wheat, corn, rice, this is true of practically every commodity. It's gotten cheaper and cheaper to produce them with time. And part of this is because of the rise in CO2. These are actual experiments done in laboratory settings where you do 295 ppm is about where we were 50 years ago. It's been rising. We're a little over 400 parts per million CO2 now. But if you compare the two, the question is how fast will these plants grow when you raise the CO2 level? And in every case, raising the CO2 level will increase the growth rate of plants. This is another one at 600 parts per million. I'm afraid we're not going to get to 600 parts per million. It would be nice because it would be so much easier to grow our agricultural plants. But anyway, it just continues on up. So that's basically a summary of the research on it. You can get into the details of it, but it's pretty easy to show that humans are not warming the Earth. Nothing we've done has warmed the Earth. These are all natural fluctuations. But what is going on, and I thought it was interesting, 14 years ago when my dad first ran against DeFazio, and DeFazio said, quote, "Robinson claims that the global warming is a myth designed to enslave us." And he considered that was a far out position. But look at what's happened. I mean, Oregon has adopted laws. We must cut off our CO2 use. We must stop use of hydrocarbons by 2035 or something. We're supposed to be reducing it. They put a bill in the legislature in the short session to extend their time a little bit because they're having a little trouble with that. My dad didn't vote for it. Why bother? Why let them out of anything? You vote no on everything. Bill couldn't be more right. It's incredible. But this has become an enormous political issue. They're trying to force electric cars on us. They're trying to cut off use of our energy. And they're trying to put us all into solar panels. No matter how cheap solar panels become, you're not going to get your energy that way. You'd have to coat the entire state of California with solar panels. Think about it. It's not going to happen. And they want us to do wind. Again, you have the problem with wind. And all these things, they'll brag about the nameplate output of the wind turbines, and they just don't produce much energy because they're only on part of the time. It's crazy. We joke about it. You look closely at a wind farm, and you'll see the little tiny power plant coming out. And then we joke about it. Well, that's just to run the wind farm. So, but anyway, thank you very much. Holly's done a fantastic job. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today, and thank you. I'm looking forward to the rest of the speakers.